Good evening, everybody. This is Nevin Gusak, your host of the Patriotic Populist. With me is my co-host, Herschel Miller. How you doing, Herschel?
Oh, I'm doing good, Nevin.
Great, great. I'm doing great myself. With me is my trusty liquor of choice, Mama Juana, which is from the Dominican Republic. I highly recommend it. Also, a nice cool glass of water as well to get me through tonight's show. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the Trump administration, a report card, and then we're going to be talking about the election of 2020, and then we're going to be talking about the storming of Capitol Hill by the pro-Trump militants. And first, I'd like to open up with a moment of silence for 10 seconds for those who died on both sides during the storming at Capitol Hill, and particularly for those who put their lives on the line to defend Capitol Hill and the legislatures, whether we like them or not, from what would have been, frankly, harm. Okay. Well, I think what we want to do is to give the viewers and the listeners some background of our opinion on Trump. Both of us, I will disclose this, both of us supported Trump in 2016 and the 2015 primary. And I think the reason why we both did, I know the reason why I should say that we did, is because he represented a populism, because he was a wealthy man. He was not dependent on corporate donors, unlike the other Republican candidates and Hillary Clinton on the Democratic side. He also represented a civic nationalism, which was, at least for the most part, ostensibly not overtly racist, although, of course, he did say things that certainly appeared racist and ignorant, like dubbing Mexicans mostly thieves, rapists, and criminals, although then he conceded there were a few. It was a very imperfect package, but after decades of the country's working class, poor, small businesses, industrial base from taking a beating from really 30 to 40 years of Reaganomics and decline in the standard of living and quality of life, people really were itching for change, for frankly profound structural changes. And Trump confidently positioned himself as someone who could really turn this country onto what we would feel is the right path. And the bottom line is that he reinvented himself in business, at least so he appeared himself. He obviously went bankrupt by 1990 in some of his real estate dealings, and he reinvented himself. About 10 years later, he became a television slash media personality, had a whole string of shows, ventured into other businesses and investments. So it appeared that he was kind of the comeback kid. And that was very helpful. Now, I had my misgivings about Trump. I was uncomfortable with the fact that he flip-flopped on issues like his position on the embargo on communist Cuba, his doing business with China through his business dealings or attempted business dealings with the Russians, and him picking Mike Pence, who I opposed as a force in Conservative Incorporated. Mike Pence was, even though he posed as this Christian kind of pro-American kind of person, he was very much in favor of NAFTA. He was in favor of trade with communist China. He was for getting rid of, in Indiana when he was governor, getting rid of the prevailing wage protections. He was totally in the bag for right to work. which is, of course, against the interests of the America's working classes. He was for anti-gay conversion therapy that was subsidized by the by government, federal or state. A whole host of things I really was deeply concerned about Pence. Pence to me represented everything that was wrong about sort of this Reaganite conservatism. So I was very concerned that Trump put him on board, but I rationalized it as a political move to get conservatives into his camp, because conservatives, the sort of Tea Party Reaganite ideology, and the people that represented it, like Glenn Beck, Mark Levin, and other radio commentators and activists and conservative think tanks, were totally opposed to Trump. They thought he was a socialist. They thought he was a populist. They didn't like populism. Reaganites hate true populism, and they also don't like nationalism either of any kind, including positive nationalism. So uh, it was kind of I understood the logic behind including Mike Pence. And from that point, during his administration, for the most part, everything went downhill rather fast. And COVID and the Trump administration's response to COVID was really made the decline and the failures of administration much more deeper and much more significant, much more profound. But, we're going to talk about the failures of the Trump administration momentarily, but I wanted to give the audience an understanding of why I supported Trump issue by issue. He was for modernizing and improving our infrastructure on all levels. He was against free trade agreements. He highlighted the threat of China. Even in his books, he highlighted the threat of Putin and Yeltsin's Russia, which was very different than the mainstream views of Russia, that the Cold War has ended and we need to move on and make friends with Russia, sign more arms control treaties, etc. Trump was also for the partial re-regulation of the national economy. He called for the reinstitution of the Glass-Steagall Act, and he was also for tax reform where the wealthier people, the super wealthy, would pay more, while people like you and I would tend to pay less. And of course, how wrong we were on that. How wrong. Of course, that turned out to be another broken campaign promise. He was for closing in the carried interest loophole. He was for not privatizing or raising the retirement ages for Social Security and Medicare. He was also not for cutting Medicaid. The list goes on and on and on. He really wasn't gung-ho about destroying unions. He really didn't have much of positions on things like right to work. A lot of many positive things, that were associated with his campaign in 2015, 2016. He also tepidly was for campaign finance reform and promised in his initial list of promises after he won the general election of 2016, Trump was wanted to take measures against lobbyists. And he also, at times, was for universal health care, too, as well. He actually pledged that he would construct a healthcare system in the United States that would be better, even better than Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, that everybody would love and that everybody would be covered. But in many respects, Trump did a 360 and violated a lot of the promises that resonated with me, and I suspect with you. So what was your position, Herschel, on Trump in 2015, 2016?
So, given the context, in 2015, I would have been a junior in high school because I graduated in 2016. No, I would have been a senior. It would have been the first semester of my senior year is really when the election started to heat up. So what I saw in Trump was a man that, like you said, couldn't be bought. That was an outsider. That wasn't from the political establishment, like so many of the candidates from the Republican field. that wasn't Hillary Clinton. Now, I have to say that you could probably say that that was the biggest reason that I supported Trump, is simply because I despised everything that Hillary Clinton stood for. She
Me
was
too.
such an unlikable, unredeeming, had no redeeming qualities as far as I was concerned.
Hmm.
And I wasn't ever going to vote for her. And I saw in Trump, something that maybe this guy could be the answer. Because, at the time I was a fairly standard Republican, tax cuts, deregulation, the whole Reaganite stick.
Hmm.
But
And I
with
had
Trump,
moved away from, and I'm sorry to interrupt. I had moved away from that at that point, by the way, to let the viewers know.
yeah. So I thought that Trump was the guy. I really did. I thought that this man can be the answer, the person that could finally come in and drain the swamp and fix all of these problems and cut the bureaucracy, let me make a better living. And I really wanted to believe it. But by the midterms in 2018, not only had I left the Republican Party, but I'd left Trump. Because to me, in the 2 years that Donald Trump, his first 2 years from 2016 to 2018, 2017, if you want to get technical, he had passed one of the worst tax bills in U.S. history, that nearly all of the benefits went to the top percentile of our economy, left middle class and poor people out in the cold. You know, he had run around screaming about China, Iran, and North Korea when we had so many domestic problems here in the country that were still unaddressed. He used his platform to rile up his supporters about caravans that were coming up here from South America and acting like the United States was about to cease to exist as a nation. I mean, it was just, he fell into becoming the everyday Republican that I hated.
Hmm.
And maybe it wasn't him. Maybe it was his cabinet. I don't know. I wasn't in the White House. I wasn't in them rooms during the debates. But what I know is that if you look at what Trump has done, there are good things that we'll talk about in this show. But a whole hell of a lot of it could have come out of Jeb Bush's White House, or Ted Cruz's White House, or one of these other Republicans that Trump beat because he wasn't a Republican like they were.
Hmm. Hmm.
And and I'll never vote for another standard Republican again as long as I live. And I think that because of Trump, hell, I have a hard time voting for any Republican at this point, if this is what we have to expect from Republican populism.
Where Republican populism is kind of an oxymoron, it's a contradiction because really they're not true populists because they really don't enact policies that are against, or shall we say, that will adequately control our mostly corrupt elites. And that's the issue. I could not stand Hillary Clinton either. I mean, she indicated support for different causes, minimum wages, a much more firmer trade policy and whatnot, which I agreed with on the surface, but I knew she was lying. She would not do any of it. I mean, she is the wife of Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton joined hands on many occasions with Republicans to pass legislation or enact policies that were detrimental to our shared but earned prosperity as a nation, as well as our national security. Hillary Clinton was also a corporate globalist, as WikiLeaks, as declassified documents from WikiLeaks indicated. She made speeches to Wall Street bankers, which indicated basically a borderless hemisphere with complete free trade and open borders. And look, you and I have nothing against people of other nations, people of different colors. But for the corporate globalists, they just view them as basically expendable sources of cheap labor to be exploited, essentially. And that I have a problem with that. So I felt I didn't have much of a choice but to vote for Trump. Jill Stein, while there are positions that I agreed with her on in a very loose sense, she was too far left, way too socialistic for my tastes, and she was frankly dreadful for the most part on national security. So I couldn't vote for her. And, I certainly would never vote for a libertarian because I disagree big time with libertarian economic policies uh, for the most part. So I couldn't vote for the libertarian candidate. I felt at the time I couldn't vote for Hillary Clinton, so I just went with Trump. And I campaign from him. I mean, on different interviews for different radio shows, I supported Trump critically. I mean, I wasn't like totally worshiping him, but I thought he was the one. And I was coming from not from a standard Republican point of view. Already, I was pretty much done. I was totally done with the Republican Party and the conservative movement. But I felt that Trump was a different kind of Republican, and I studied his different statements that he's made since the 1980s, where he has criticized aspects of Reagan's 1986 tax code, the deficit spending of Reagan, the unfair trade agreements that were decimating American industry, all of these different things. And I was like, yeah, go Trump. I thought he was injecting into the national conversation issues and basically arguments that really were never addressed or posed before in the United States political scene in quite a long time. But with Trump, when he became president, early on, I became very disillusioned. One of his first acts was to get rid of benefits that would have made home buying for people easier by lowering the cost of mortgage insurance because it's hard for people in this day and age for the people to save up for a down payment. So Obama had placed in policies or programs which would have assisted those first time home buyers. So that was gotten rid of. So that kind of deregulation, and then of course the tax cuts, that kind of raised my eyebrows a bit because I'm thinking, oh gosh, he is going back to Reaganism. And Reaganism, as I point out in my book, Turning the Page, I document basically how Reaganism has destroyed the middle class, has destroyed really the heartland of the United States of America. And
There's
I was deeply concerned that Trump was, listening to many people that were onboarded into his administration. Mike Pence basically was the gatekeeper that managed the transition team that brought people from the American Enterprise Institute and the Heritage Foundation. These were corporate conservative organizations. They also brought in a lot of industry lobbyists, and much has been written. You can just Google it, uh, where Trump brought a massive number of industry lobbyists into his government. He brought in people that opposed him in 2015 and 2016 to guide him on things like economic policy. People like Stephen Moore, people like was it James Shirk, I believe is his name, from Heritage Foundation, people like Larry Kudlow, people like Art Laffer. I mean, these are people that supported trade with communist China and opposed any measures to control trade with China. Many of them were for open borders immigration, not because they liked immigrants coming into the country or the immigrants themselves, because they view them as essentially cheap labor, because they did not believe in the New Deal. They didn't believe in protectionism and things of that nature. Essentially, they believed in corporate dominance and the dominance by the employer class, which masquerades as free market ideology. Because to most people, that's what free market means business controls everything. The employer is always right, and the employee has limited to no power. That's what free market essentially means in practical reality. Trump, I would say 25% of his policies I think were long overdue and were positive, but the other 75% were so horrible that I, frankly, jumping ahead, I had a hard time voting for him in 2020. And he did a standard Republican campaign for the most part in 2020. It was very different than 2015, 2016.
Before you
But,
go on, this is what we need to talk about.
yeah, yeah.
Because
So
I
what are
think
your thoughts?
so. The 20. This is something that I would like to highlight to people too. If you go back to 2015 and 2016, and you look at the ads that Trump was releasing, what he was talking about and what he was doing, it was about how the American middle class had been gutted by outsourcing. That how he talked something about tax rates. He wasn't some Reaganite on taxes. You know
Mm-hmm.
he Trump hammered the neo. He beat the neoliberals to death about wars, about bad trade deals, about ineffective government leadership. I mean, the things that Trump was hammering in 2016. There's a reason that Trump won a huge number of Obama voters in 2016, and you couldn't. I mean, if you look at it from the outside looking in, Obama and Trump are very different presidents, very different how they carried themselves, their ideologies, what they wanted to push. So for somebody to pick up a bunch of voters from what could be considered near his polar opposite as president,
Mm-hmm.
he's doing something right. He is tapping into something that is sorely lacking in American politics. And you fast forward that to 2020. It was tax cuts, it was deregulation, it was business as usual. It was law and order,
Owning
it
the libs,
yeah,
owning the libs.
it was such a standard run of the mill Republican campaign that I almost wondered if he was trying to lose sometimes. And this is a thing that I have a lot of questions about for myself that I'll probably never get the answer to. But if you looked at the Tax Cuts and Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017,
Mm-hmm.
Sherrod Brown, senator from Ohio, I believe, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
He was pushing things in the Tax Cuts and Deregulation Act that Trump was okay with. I'm sure Nevin could
Yes.
list a couple of them better. Now,
Yeah.
Sherrod Brown, for anybody that's unaware of this, is a very progressive, very labor oriented senator, a real working class kind of guy. He obviously have my disagreements with him, but Sherrod Brown has fought for the working class for a long time. And Trump was open to Sherrod Brown's opinion being heard. This hard blue Democrat, but he let his advisors like Stephen Moore and like Larry Kudlow and like his what was his name? He used to be a Goldman Sachs executive.
Oh, Gary Cohn. In fact, it's so funny to segue on that. Gary Cohn actually took a poll, and this is on video, where he said to a room full of corporate executives, he was like, "Oh, how many of you, after the Tax Cut and Jobs Act was passed, how many of you are going to bring all the jobs back and pay your workers well?" Out of a room full of a bunch of executives, only a few raised their hands. Most of them did not raise their hands. And we have history to look at. We have history of the Reagan era tax cuts. You have the era of George W. Bush, and studies have shown that, in fact, not only did they not create jobs, they actually jobs continue to be outsourced. In fact, both W. Bush and Reagan had programs which encouraged outsourcing, for reasons of both foreign policy as well as remaining competitive with other countries, because the way America was competitive under neoliberal market fundamentalism was basically wage suppression, not targeted investments and subsidies to improve production processes and things of that nature. So yeah, the problem was is that Paul Ryan, who was the House Speaker at the time, combined with corporate lobbyists, they got to Trump's ear. They manipulated Trump, and basically what you see is what you get. There's a very interesting thing, and I wanted to read it. This was an article in Breitbart uh, several years ago, and it was in the beginning of the Trump administration. So I'll read this. This is from my book, Turning the Page, and I'll read this. Republican congressional leaders and members of the House Freedom Caucus attempted to halt Trump's trade and immigration agenda in favor of donor class priorities like repealing the Affordable Care Act and so called tax reform. One senior aide to a member of the House Freedom Caucus reported, quote, many members of the Freedom Caucus never opposed Paul Ryan's positions on trade and immigration the way their constituents do. So they're more than happy to ignore and cast aside the policies that got Trump elected in exchange for going along with the Ryan's policies. They'd rather keep the status quo and march lockstep with Ryan than have to stir things up by electing someone who would fight for Trump's mandate and fight to fulfill the wishes of the American people. Another congressional aide to a member of the Freedom Caucus admitted, everybody in the House Freedom Caucus and the establishment at this point is looking to play the reconciliatory games of saying, well, Trump was really saying what I've been saying all along. In other words, they were trying to reinvent Trump's populism as merely deregulation, tax cuts, Reaganism, prosecuting the culture wars, etc. So everybody, this congressional aide said, everybody in the House Freedom Caucus and the establishment at this point is looking to play the reconciliatory game of saying, well, Trump was really saying what I've been saying all along. Of course, we all know this isn't true. The people who voted for him don't think that's what he was running on. I worry we've got establishment Republicans like Mike Pence and Reince Priebus trying to tell Trump that the people who voted for him didn't really mean X or didn't really want Y. That worries me. So that's, a big issue here. So,
Well, the point I'd like to make is
yeah,
when,
go ahead.
when people call Trump or when people talk about rhinos, they say Republicans in name only.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like they're missing the point of something. Trump is more of a rhino than Mitch McConnell, Lindsey Graham, or Ron Johnson. See,
Mm-hmm.
them three I just mentioned, they are the Republicans. Tax cuts, deregulation, outsourcing of jobs, destruction of unions, and wars in every country around the world. That
Exactly.
is the Republican Party of, well, at least since Reagan, but, it has its roots even further back than that.
Mm-hmm.
Trump, and this is the central point of this episode, he was supposed to not be that. Trump didn't get elected for tax cuts and deregulation. He got elected for NAFTA and Iraq and
Exactly.
Afghanistan. And I think a point that should be hammered is it wasn't, the Republican Party are going to act like Trump never happened. They're going to try their best to wipe away the last 4 years and go back to business as usual. And if you've watched the news lately, you're starting to see it.
Yes.
Many Republican senators and representatives are starting to distance themselves from Trump. He's been basically abandoned on all fronts. And you're already starting to see the debt hawkery, Mitt Romney type Republican resurgence. They're going to act like this never happened. They're going to wipe away populism. They're going to wipe away Trump, Steve Bannon, and all the rest of them.
Mm-hmm.
And act like it goes back. It was them that cost Trump the election. Now I'll say Trump definitely had his hand in losing this election.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at the advisors that Trump had, Steve Mnuchin, prime example. Trump was
Mm-hmm.
supposed to drain the swamp, and yet he appointed Steve Mnuchin, which is, I believe, is his Treasury Secretary. Nevin, correct me on that. Steve Mnuchin, Treasury Secretary.
Yeah, he was a Treasury Secretary for the entire Trump administration, and he was from Goldman Sachs. Which is something that Trump campaigned against. Hillary Clinton and Ted Cruz with their donations and control by Goldman Sachs, and Trump campaigned against that.
Yeah,
But
and then appointed
go
him,
ahead.
and then just appointed the man. This is what the failure of the Trump presidency is going to be. That he was supposed to surround himself with the best people. Now, here's a list of people that Donald Trump had surrounded himself with. Mike Flynn, career leech that has wormed his way through politics and the military forever.
Mm-hmm.
Mike Pence, a guy that has just, look, people like Mike Pence. I don't know why. Like you said earlier, big NAFTA supporter, big, supporter for PNTRs with every country on earth, big war hawk. Steve Mnuchin, Goldman Sachs executive that helped cause the financial crisis of 2008 and
Mm-hmm.
got away with it with a bigger bonus from it. uh, his lawyer, I can't ever remember his name, one of the most despicable examples of people, Roger Stone, who has
Oh,
a
Stone.
who
Oh,
has a 20-year track record of being a piece of crap. You've got
you're insulting pieces of crap, by the way,
yeah,
when you say that.
you had Larry Kudlow, who's never been right about a damn thing in his life, who has been so wrong about politics that if you bet against him, you'd almost guaranteed to be right.
Yeah, I think you
You
and
know,
I are more right about economics than Larry Kudlow. But
you
I
know,
think what,
and I would hope so. But that's the thing is that Trump's administration, then there's to say nothing of Mike Pompeo or uh, his first attorney general. I can't ever remember his name. The I do not recall guy.
oh,
Uh,
Jeff Sessions.
yes, Sessions. What's funny too is that every time one of these people left the White House, it was always about how bad they was at their jobs and how they were dragging down the White House. And I'm like, well, you hired them in the first place.
Yes.
You know, it's not like they just showed up one day and started working.
Well,
These people,
this goes back to one of Trump's weaknesses, and
yeah,
that's weakness for flattery. And let me tell you a story, and I document this. Natalia Dubinina, whose father was a Soviet UN ambassador during the late 1980s, the Soviets dealt with Trump back in the late 1980s. Dubinina recalled that, quote, Trump melted at once when he was told by her father, who was a Soviet UN ambassador, that Trump Tower was the first building he visited after landing in New York. Dubinina recalled that Trump is, quote, an emotional person, somewhat impulsive. He needs recognition. And of course, when he gets it, he likes it. My father's visit worked on him. Trump like honey to a bee. And then when you go to groups like ALEC and the Koch network and big business lobby, they knew it. In fact, there is a quote by Freda Levin, I believe is her name, or Freda Katz, I believe. Uh, Let me just put that up here. Hold on. I'm sorry. It's just this is real important because this is going to kind of, you know, justify my position, if you will. Uh, just forgive me. Da, da,
I'll
da.
tell you, one of the things too that has got me so bad is if you look at the internal structure of the Trump White House, it was never stable. At any
No.
point during the 4 years that Trump's been in office, it was always somebody that was getting fired or getting let go or in this big public war with Donald Trump. I mean, even Betsy DeVos's husband, and the crap that was started. It's just Trump was supposed to hire the best and the brightest. And yet here we are 4 years down the line, and half of his cabinet's made up of new people. And not because they went on to better and brighter positions, but because half of them got fired. You know, General Mattis, who's a generally respected person in American military circles, at least, but especially most conservative circles, who was, this firebrand, old style Marine that was going to change the way the military operated. And
Mm-hmm.
like I said, people loved Mattis. Like the memes were epic with Mattis was the Secretary of Defense. And then all of a sudden, he's this nobody that was too stupid to be a general. And it's like, Trump, you can't have it both ways.
Well, he also created a cabinet of rivals and oppositionists in opposition to each other. He did things very similar to Reagan. And in the case of Trump, that paralyzed his agenda because General Mattis, I mean, I of course, support him for his service. And, as I do with all military officers and soldiers of any rank. But he was opposed to Trump's so called America First trade initiatives and tariffs and whatnot. And we'll talk about that later. But I found the quote, incidentally. One of the things before I read the quote, I think you highlight a very important point. I mean, Trump's cabinet was like a revolving door. And if you notice, he never took any responsibility for anything, not his bad decisions, not the cabinet picks, and things of that nature. And I think, again, because Trump has a weakness for flattery, he is a bit of an egomaniac and a narcissist to a large degree. Freda Levin, who is a Koch network donor, she mentioned that on many issues, Trump is a blank slate, so anybody with expertise is in an amazing position to shape his agenda. And what happened is first Chris Christie and but especially Mike Pence was served as a gatekeeper that brought in lots and lots of people from the Koch network, from Conservative Incorporated, and industry lobbyists. You look at Betsy DeVos, Amway, staunch supporter of school privatization, strong supporter of educational exchanges and learning with Communist China, and even learning educational policies from Communist China. If she felt there was quite a bit to learn from Communist China, I don't know what, but that's what she asserted. You have people like Larry Kudlow and at one point Trump's Secretary of Commerce, I forget the gentleman's name off the top of my head. He was a big investor, and they were both supporters of Red China, and they opposed efforts to limit or erase the trade deficit with Communist China. So you had that. You had, the Secretary of the Treasury, Steve Mnuchin, a Goldman Sachs guy, head of the National Economic Council, Gary Cohn, and then Larry Kudlow. I mean, this is the swamp. Trump campaigned against the ideologies of these individuals, but the problem is that Trump, as I documented, has a weakness for flattery. He is a bit of a narcissist. He really was not adept at governing. And he was a blank slate, to quote the Koch network donor, Freight 11. And you have ALEC, and you have Heritage, and you have the Koch network, and all of them, they marched into the administration. The only two good people that Trump had was Peter Navarro, who headed the Office of White House Office of Manufacturing, I believe it was called, and the U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer, who was a very, very noted critic of our free trade policies, and in fact has represented as a lawyer American companies that were impacted by product dumping by predatory trade partners. So he did have some good people in the administration, but there are many times that Navarro and Lighthizer, and when Steve Bannon was in the administration, those true populists or economic nationalists, particularly Navarro and Lighthizer, I question whether Steve Bannon was a true populist. We can go into that at another time. But they all clash with the globalists and the corporate conservatives in the administration over issues with trade with China, over issues of reshoring our pharmaceutical industry and production of PPPs and other medical equipment during the coronavirus pandemic that we're still going through right now. And you had the Koch network, the conservative incorporated types that fought against efforts to reshore that type of industry from China. So again, Trump really has to take blame. He's an adult. He has to put on the big boy pants, and he has to admit that he fucked up and created a shit show. I mean, there are things I agree with him on. Withdrawal from the INF treaty that the Russians were violating left and right. I agree with that. I agree with his studies that he's commissioned through the Pentagon to reindustrialize the United States, particularly for the defense industries. I agree with that. I agree with the withdrawal from the JCPOA, the Iran deal, which Iran violated in spirit, which I document in my book. I mean, we could have a show on the Iran deal. I agree with his withdrawal of assistance to the PLO-dominated Palestine Authority, and there are other things I agree with, the tariffs, although I don't think tariffs alone is going to reindustrialize the United States, because you need to have a bipartisan commitment for decades to reindustrialize the United States. You need an actual consensus with most Democrats, most Republicans, that crosses over into administration from an administration to reshore our industry. We can't do it in 4 years. And Trump brought in people that really undermined his stated goal. And
Not to
frankly, he
mention
didn't
the
care
Republicans
because he
in the
got
Senate, too.
distracted by bullshit issues.
Yeah. You think
Go
about
ahead.
the Republicans in the Senate, they weren't ever going to help him, ever.
No.
Mitch McConnell Now, mind you, Mitch McConnell's wife has a huge import-export business with Communist China. Or she has other areas that she does business with, but a huge portion of Mitch McConnell's personal wealth is due to his wife's business with Communist China.
Mm-hmm.
Now you really think that Mitch McConnell, Ron Free Market Johnson, Lindsey, I don't have a spine Graham, or any of them were ever going to break, to hurt their donors, to hurt their corporate oligarchs that are running the Republican and Democrat Party, but especially the Republican Party. They were never going to give Trump an inch. If Trump, and this is one of the only points that I will say that there's probably not a hell of a lot Trump could do. The system does not want to stop making money off of cheap Chinese manufacturing. It just doesn't. And every day I lose a little more faith that we can even stop it by nonviolent means, because when I look around, the NBA, most of Hollywood, most any businesses in the United States is attached at the hip to communist China in one way or another. We are watering the tree that will hang us one day. Because make no mistake to the people in the audience, communist China is a threat and it's growing. And they will overtake us if they haven't already at this point, because, we don't have any manufacturing. We don't have any of that. And this is what such a disastrous part of the Trump presidency is that tax cuts and deregulation was never going to reindustrialize the United States. Somebody asked me once, well, what would you have done? I said, I would have done it at gunpoint if necessary. The point is, you have to have somebody with some balls to do something like this, that has to walk into the White House with a unified cabinet, with a unified agenda, and say that this is what we're going to do, and I'm going to do it by any means necessary. And that's how important this issue was, and he totally whiffed on it.
Well,
U.S. manufacturing is losing.
it basically, yeah, no, all excellent points. It shows the failure of our system. We have people, including analysts that I hold in esteem, who really understand the nature of Russia and China, and now they have corrupted our capitalist system. But they don't want to take I think they're unwilling to take the additional step to say truly and really really and truly that we need a system reset, because our system of so-called checks and balances has been totally corrupted. Why? Because of corporate greed, essentially. Thomas Jefferson aptly wrote, "Merchants have no country. The mere spot they stand on does not constitute so strong an attachment as that from which they draw their gains." And it is so true. Karl Marx said, "What the bourgeoisie therefore produces above all are its own gravediggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable." Lenin's, who is the first dictator of the Soviet Union on December 21st, 1920, said, "It is necessary to bribe capitalism with extra profit, and we will get the basics with the aid of which we will strengthen ourselves, will finally get up on our feet and then defeat it." And I can bore the audience and you with all these different quotes here, but the fact remains is one of the biggest reasons why I left the right and have really become dissatisfied with our current system is because it has not addressed the chief national security threat to the United States internally, and that is corporate capitalism, because they're the ones, for the most part, that have lobbied incessantly for trade with communist China, with the old Soviet Union, with National Socialist Germany, with Cuba, with Venezuela, with Islamic Iran. You name the country, the capitalists are joined at the hip, all together, lobbying for increased trade with them, decontrolling, liberalizing export controls, and responsible for selling dual-use technologies and even weapons of war. And that's, it is what it is. But we need to have a constitution, a new constitution that keeps, as I said, a lot of the good, a lot of the old that is good, like Bill of Rights or whatnot, but we need to seriously address the issues of people in the private sector that have way too much power and compromise the decision making of our federal government. That's the problem. A conservative national security vision cannot be achieved unless you address the issue of private sector power and it overpowering and overwhelming state interests, national security interests. And that covers a wide expanse. You talk about Mitch McConnell and Ron Johnson. I mean, Mitch McConnell himself said in the 1992 that it's difficult to find a communist in China with a flashlight, meaning he couldn't find any communists. And he was getting campaign support from the US China Business Council, which was a front for the Chinese Communist Party and American multinational corporations. His wife was related to the former Secretary General of the Chinese Communist Party, Jiang Zemin, and was covered in her ears up to her ears with investments through, I think, shipping, maritime shipping with communist Chinese tied business interests. Under the Trump administration and under Elaine Chao, who was Secretary of Transportation, our merchant shipbuilding industry continued to be battered, much to the chagrin of national security advocates. The list goes on and on. Ron Johnson said in 2010 when he was running for Senate that he supported permanent normal trade relations with communist China. Here's this professional anti-socialist. Well, his business, Packer Plastics, profited from business with communist China. He actually also said when he was a senator that the climate for investment is better in communist China than in the United States. A lot of these conservative and Tea Party politicians like Ron Johnson, they have no problem with socialist totalitarianism. If they or their donors can make money, they'll overlook that. But if it causes them to pay more of a tax bill or collect less profit, then all of a sudden it's the road to serfdom and the country is going to hell and it's creeping communism and everything else. And you know, this needs to be addressed on a wider level other than our show and a few others. That's all I'm saying. And this is why we need a new movement that's going to repudiate this sort of Tea Party, Reaganite shit show economics and politics and hypocrisy, as well as that of the tanky left, because we don't want the tankies coming to power, and we don't want the Hitler worshippers to come to power in this country.
Well, Nevin, getting back to the Trump presidency, on the subject of trade with China, Jared and Ivanka are attached at the hip to China and have been for years. Ivanka, a lot of her products, she has products made in China that are still made in China through Trump's trade war. It's just another layer of hypocrisy that I can't stand. There was Trump hats, the MAGA hats, made in China. It's the for me and not for thee mentality right there that Trump was not supposed to have. And it all goes back to the central point. Trump, the ideas that Trump ran on are winners. Economic nationalism, populism, unions, and shit like that. That is a winning formula for candidates. But Trump just lost himself in it. And I hope and I pray for Trump that down the line he can find some peace with it. But right now, Trump's loss is his fault. It is. And at the end of the day, we, and I'm going to segue into this here in a second. We can make all the excuses or come up with all the conspiracies in the world, but the fact of the matter is that Trump just lost. And what a horrifying thing to think about that we go back to business as usual now. Because one of the things, and I want to say something, I will not look at this as the worst president that ever we ever had. First of all, because we've had some horrible presidents. Second off, because what I want to talk about now, there is positive aspects to the Trump presidency, and I think they should be highlighted because we have to give credit where credit's due. Trump, the reason that I'm on this show right now, probably the reason you are, is because Trump did take a baseball bat to the establishment way of doing things. I mean, in a lot of ways, he broke the spectrum wide open. There's people that you could read about for days on both sides of the spectrum now that have either been elected to office or have started podcasts or other influential jobs specifically because Trump blew the doors off of the establishment. You know, ideas, acceptable ideas like populism, like certain aspects of nationalism. I still won't go that far, but there's certain aspects of nationalism that are more acceptable now. Economic protectionism, these things, people kind of take it for granted now. 4 years down the line, they were basically dead concepts before Donald Trump because the neoliberal side of the Democratic Party is won out, and they're by no means populist or nationalist.
Mm-hmm.
The Republican Party has never even claimed to be populist. There are good aspects, and it's such a terrible thing that now we have to go through 4 years of the same crap that we used to deal with, of lip service and smiles and happy faces and nothing actually getting done for any of us. Because to anybody out there in the audience that happens to listen to this, Joe Biden is a glorified centrist by most accounts. In fact, I wouldn't even call him that because centrist might actually, do something. Joe
Mm.
Biden is the epitome of the do nothing American elite. He's not going to push for any substantial changes. He's not out there campaigning like FDR trying to make America a better country to live in. He's going to call conservatives crazy. He's going to pander to people that don't actually care. And at the end of the day, the country will go on in the same corrupt hellhole that we are in right now. And that's why it was so disastrous that Trump lost, because for whatever it was worth, at least with Trump, it kept us on our toes. It kept us, with our eyes glued to the television. There was people that watched C-SPAN for the first time in their life because they wanted to know what was going on, and they followed politics religiously. And what I fear most now is that with Trump out of the picture, Democrats aren't going to care anymore. The majority of the neoliberal centrist Democrats, they'll go back to their lives like it never happened. The conservatives will still rant and wave, but they'll be, free market fundamentalists by tomorrow.
Hmm.
It's a real dire situation that we found ourselves in, and it didn't have to be this way. Had Trump held on to his populism and pushed harder, I think he might have won by the largest landslide victory, at least since Reagan.
And
Because
if he made responsible picks for his administration that would allow him unquestionably to carry forth as an agenda, because obviously he was not fit to govern. He's not the governing type. He is impulsive, as we talked about. And the bottom line is that he needed to pick an administration that needed to be in sync with his stated ideology. And we can debate whether he really believed it or not, but that's how he could have won, essentially. And he could have joined hands with Democrats. There were some Democrats and independents that were willing to join him. Notably, Bernie Sanders in the beginning of 2017 said, look, if Trump passes legislation that supports workers and does what he promises, I will support him. You know, yes, Trump had a toxic background, obviously, with women and the corporate Democrats who believe in identity politics, who play that card very opportunistically. They played that up, so it really kind of stymied Democratic, potential Democratic crossover to Trump in the Senate and the House, and that was very unfortunate. And Trump has a very kind of somewhat of a rather loathsome record with women and also his businesses practices and whatnot. And that I know from my stepfather, even, who was in the building materials industries for literally like almost 50 to 60 years of his life in the New York City area, and has told me stories about Trump and how he cheated customers and didn't pay them and whatnot. So, he had a toxicity about him that his opposition were all more than willing to exploit. But yes, he could have constructed a legacy that really could have made him look really, 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 really good. And that would have played into his ego in a positive way because then he can say, look what I've done. I've helped so many people. I'm the greatest. I'm the best, and this and that and everything else. What has he left us? A shambles. And he has to take responsibility. You mentioned something about Ivanka and Jared, and I'm glad you mentioned that because Jared in particular played a negative role in pushing Trump towards much more anti-populist positions, along with conservative incorporated types, by the way. Trump's immigration policies were also deeply troubling and deeply contradictory. We take an example that I've mentioned in previous shows when ICE raided 7 poultry processing plants that were operated by Koch Foods in Mississippi. Over 680 undocumented immigrant workers were arrested while no CEOs were in prison. And those plants were targeted as by ICE as a result of attempts to organize unions at these plants. And we all know that undocumented immigrants tend to be abused by employers and they undercut American wages. But again, no CEOs were in prison. Why is that? In fact, there's one statistic I mentioned in my book where under Obama, more employers who violated immigration rules were jailed under Obama than under Trump. And the source of labor arbitrage resulting from legal as well as illegal immigration or undocumented immigration really stems from corporations, from employers who just want to exploit cheap labor. And these are human beings. You don't treat human beings like crap across the board. And then on top of that, you also don't undercut your own people of all races who are really want to have a full-time job that pays a decent wage. So Trump betrayed us on that front. And Trump, for example, his Mar-a-Lago club sought to hire 61 foreign workers for the 2018 winter season. You know, the Department of Homeland Security in May of 2018 agreed to allow an additional 15,000 H-2B visas in 2018. You know, Trump's golf club in Westchester County in New York requested the feds to hire 14 foreign cooks and servers. I mean, I could go on and on and on about that. So I think you hit the nail on the head. There's also a hypocrisy there. And Trump, I'm sure, had the power and influence to call, you know, Don Jr. or Eric and the people that were running his string of businesses to hire Americans, you know, to do those positions. Or if the immigrant workers are so good, pay them the same wages as they would American workers. So,
Yeah. Well, you know, and it's a point that I would like to make because I do want to get to the positive before we end here. I understand the argument that Trump is just one president, you know, just a president. He's just one person. He can't change the world by himself. I get that. You know, the way the United States government is set up, presidents don't actually have that much direct power to make and write laws. But what presidents have is influence. One thing that Obama done very successfully in 2010, before the Affordable Care Act was passed, was throwing his influence around to basically say that any Democrat that votes no on the Affordable Care Act, I'm going to primary you, and you will lose your seat. See, presidents can do stuff like that because presidents are elected by the people. Senators are just kind of checked off, usually by party name. I mean, most people vote. You know, I don't know that much about James Lankford, my representative. I didn't vote for James. I'm just using that. But most people don't actually pay that much attention to Senate seats and House seats. Pay attention to presidents and what presidents can do, and what Trump could have done is every time he hit a roadblock, like when the Republican Senate wasn't wanting to approve more wall funding, or when they was stymieing his attempts for better trade deals, or whatever it was, he should have thrown his weight behind, basically saying, look, you will support my efforts to build a border wall, or you will support my efforts for better trade deals, or I will primary you. Because the one thing that Trump has and will have probably until he dies is influence. Trump has a base that is possibly the most loyal base in the history of United States politics. I mean, you could argue that FDR and maybe a couple of them here and there, but it would just be a comparison of the top end of the spectrum. Trump's base is not loyal to the Republican Party. Trump's base is loyal to Trump. And that, I believe, is his biggest failure, is that he didn't capitalize on the moments that he could have.
Mm-hmm.
I understand, a lot of the 2018, up to 2018, John McCain was a thorn in Trump's side, or was it 17? I think it was 17.
17 and 18, right up until his death, as a
Yeah.
matter of fact.
I understand that and I've heard every argument. I'm not excusing or anything for John McCain. I'm just saying that there was enough support that he could have thrown his weight behind to get people elected. But at the end of the day, it is what it is. Here we are in 2020, what should have been a triumphant re-election for Donald Trump against another horrible candidate from the Democrats, turned into one of the greatest messes in U.S. political history, where you have half of the country just convinced that the election was stolen by this grand conspiracy, and you have another section of the country wagging their fingers at Republicans and telling them to go back and act like nothing ever happened. It shouldn't have been this way. It should have been a great moment in American political history where we rode through a pandemic together as one united people, and instead you still got people running around, thinking that this is some grand government conspiracy theory to steal your rights and declare, globalism. It's just such a tragedy. This is a Shakespearean tragedy that will be remembered for all.
Very well put.
And it pains me because I wanted Trump to be successful.
Mm-hmm.
There was never a point in the Trump presidency when I woke up in the morning and said, man, I hope he fails today. Look, I've got my beef with Trump. And listening to the show or any of the previous stuff that we've done, you'll know that I'm not a big fan. But I never wanted the man to fail. But here we are. Now, Nevin, there's something that I'd like to talk about before we go. And it's something that you can't look, it's the elephant in the room. The inauguration's in what? Let's say today's the 16th, so 4 days.
Mm-hmm.
And you have a sizable chunk of the Republican Party's base that is calling for martial law in this country, that is calling about, full-blown insurrections after we seen with the Capitol Hill riots.
Mm-hmm.
What do you make of it? Like, how do we as a country even begin to get past this?
Well, it's a tall order to try and assume that we're going to get through this. We are so, I hate to echo or repeat the cliche that we're just so divided, but I think it's become virtually irreparable, our division. And I hate to sound like a pessimist, but frankly, I think it's going to take a major, major catastrophe of cataclysmic proportions that could be the catalyst to unite Americans. And even then, there are Americans out there that, for varying reasons, do not want to preserve the United States or see the United States as a strong nation. I see in sort of the grander scheme of things, I see the tanky leftists, they're slowly growing. The communist forces, while not a majority, they're growing. More and more people are rightfully disenchanted with corporate capitalism and the betrayal of the American dream from what they were taught by their parents and in school. They're realizing that in many ways it's becoming more and more illusory, even a lie. So people are getting disillusioned. And even though some are organized, many are not. And it could take one demagogic leader that could unite such individuals who would want to bring down the American system. And then you have others who are militant Reaganites who will fight for corporations, essentially. Kyle Kulinski, the progressive populist commentator, had a very funny meme where he described the individuals in question who are marching militantly on the Capitol. And he said, Kyle Kulinski called it waging a revolution for more corporate tax cuts and Wall Street deregulation. And that's what these individuals essentially are doing. They're motivated by the culture wars that are put forth by the corporate conservative propagandists. They really believe in that. They really believe in owning the libs. So you have that sector. You have the two extremes clashing with each other. And then you do have the issue of so-called white nationalists, really neo-Nazis or national socialists, who will also penetrate your sort of Tea Party, Reaganite, Proud Boys kind of militants for corporate conservatism, essentially. But they'll try and exploit that and recruit people to their side. So you have that. And you have Russia and China basically. They're looking at this as an opportunity for the United States to fall, essentially. That's what I see in the long term. I just see further and further division. Um, the Biden administration, I think, will handle COVID better than Trump. But Biden, you were talking about Biden before. Biden, I have issues with Biden. Biden was for Wall Street deregulation, getting rid of Glass-Steagall, getting rid of bankruptcy protections in 2005, was a big proponent of disarmament during the 1980s vis-a-vis the Soviet threat. He was for granting communist China PNTR and entry into the World Trade Organization. On and on it goes. I mean, Biden is tremendously problematic. And he is still wedded to a lot of the free trade agenda. At least that's what his record. He supported NAFTA too as well. So, and his administration is being populated by individuals that lean more towards the corporate side than not. I wanted Trump to succeed desperately, and I want Joe Biden to succeed. I want both of them to succeed, but I don't. I uh, I truly, in my heart, and I hope I'm wrong, but I see Biden being like Obama, as you said, and you're going to have the resurgence of the Tea Party corporate types that are going to mislead us into thinking that they have the answers for making the country more prosperous, when of course they've hurt the country on so many levels. And it's going to be like the Obama shit show all over again. So we're going to go from the Trump shit show, we're going to go to the Obama 2.0 shit show, essentially. And that's going to cause more frustration, more radicalization. You're going to have Russia and China gain more and more and more power, and that's it. And there was an article that I came across, you read it, that was really good, and I think this will be kind of the last thing that we talk about. Now, I'm not a fan of RT because it is a tool of Russian propaganda, but there are times where the Russians and the Chinese have a better understanding of the weaknesses of American society than our own people, than our own apostles of American exceptionalism. And I think we have to read what our adversaries say. And there was another book that was reported in Bloomberg News, authored by Wang Huning, who is a member, I think, of the Standing Committee of the Chinese Communist Party Politburo, and he was a top political theorist to various Chinese leaders. And he talked about how, and he wrote this book in 1988 called Americans, it's called, I believe, Americans Against America or something or another. But he predicted in 1988, when he wrote this book, that America's emphasis on, quote, individualism, hedonism, and democracy, close quotes, would eventually cause rifts that sapped its competitive drive. Countries like Japan, built on, quote, collectivism, selflessness, and authoritarianism, had the upper hand. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, because those societies have a strong military, particularly China and Russia. Japan is a friendlier power. But the fact of the matter is Russia and China and their allies have gained strength, particularly Russia and China. They have not outsourced their industrial base. They have gamed the world trading system. They've increased their ICBMs and everything else. And the United States, what the Trump administration has done in his retreat from populism, has basically encouraged toxic individualism and hedonism. Everything is about making money. Everything is about the self, even not wearing masks, lockdowns, everything else. Everything is done very half assed. It's Trump, the way he handled the pandemic, for example, and he had, again, Kudlow, Stephen Moore, Art Laffer, and other apostles of individualism and economic hedonism guiding him on the economic response to COVID. And what has that resulted in? I mean, states competing with each other and hospitals competing each other for COVID supplies and whatnot to care for sick patients. I mean, the story is very well documented. This is the federalism, essentially. It's bringing a national crisis that arguably was brought upon by purposely, possibly by China. And instead of treating it as a national emergency, which requires a coordinated national plan between the feds, between the military, between state and local governments, and more of a harmony. Instead, it's been a total disaster and total divisions. I encourage people to also read the Trump administration 2017 to 2021, an obituary in Russia Today, RT. Very good article. So what comments do you have about what I say, as well as the RT article and the Bloomberg China article, Herschel?
Well, I'll tell you, the Bloomberg China article didn't interest me near as much, but the RT article, the one thing that I loved about it, China and Russia and Israel and these countries like that are on the up right now. China has cornered the market on world manufacturing. Russia is in a better place than it's been since the end of the Cold War. Israel is, well, mostly due to our own tax dollars, but Israel's in a great place right now. And what have we got? We've got a dysfunctional country, divided to the point that it hasn't been in at least 50 years, if not 100 years or 150 years. A leadership that just fell apart. And this is what I'd like to say to the Trump supporters. Go back and look at Trump on the campaign trail and look at Trump in late 2019, and you tell me that's the same guy. You tell me that Trump, who was going to bring it all together and do all of this, is the same guy that was calling the pandemic no big deal and just swinging at every baby that popped its head up. He just, I don't know what happened. I don't. But Jesus Christ, I don't know how bad we could get in such a short time. Because look, there was a long portion of Trump presidency that I thought, probably won't be the greatest. Not FDR. Could still be a really good, legacy to leave behind. But now, look, Joe Biden is not going to do anything. And China and Russia are going to take advantage of Joe like, they were before. And I don't even know what to say at this point. What words of optimism can a person give at this point? Because, look, half of this country is never going to accept Joe Biden as president. They just never will. And there's nothing that I can say, you can say, or any other person can say that will convince a large section of our population that Joe Biden is actually our president. Now, look, to call it, to be fair, there's people that I talk to now in 2021 that still think Trump, election was because the Russians hacked the voting machines. So it's not like the conservative are the only guilty party in this. But like you said, short of an absolute cataclysmic natural disaster, I don't even know where to go for here. Now, people are going to blame Trump. They're going to say that this is all Trump's fault, that everything that's bad that's happened since 2016 is Trump, and it's not. There's a lot of heads that needed to roll. Democratic leadership that was more concerned with impeaching Trump than ever working with him to solve better problems. Republican leadership that just never cared in the first place. rogue agents within the Trump administration and Trump's, the government bureaucracy that consistently undermined him. I mean, this is not all his fault, but at the end of the day, he's the president, and he will get the blame. His hand was on the wheels. You know, People blamed Obama for all kinds of crap, and look, there's a lot of things that Obama did that just make my stomach churn.
Me too.
And a lot of it, there's a lot of times it wasn't his fault, you know. Uh, but he's the president. He is the man in charge. He is the person that was supposed to fix it. And if he doesn't, well, I'm sorry. I know, but life's not fair. Every president has to overcome adversity. Yeah, Trump's had to overcome a lot of it. I get it. From the word go, the Democrats were never going to give the man a fair shot. But that doesn't mean you got to shoot yourself in the foot. And there was a lot of times there that if Trump had done it just a little different, had he been a little more ideologically consistent, had he hired a little bit better people, we're talking about an entirely different situation. Trump had the best chance of any president in modern history to drastically improve the average American life. But if you look at the statistics on it, if you look at median income, if you look at housing, percentage of the population that owns a home, if you look at manufacturing jobs, you couldn't tell me the difference in between Obama and Trump. We're hemorrhaging manufacturing jobs at the same rate that Obama was.
Actually, more. It was actually more. Actually, the first year of Trump's presidency, there was actually more jobs were outsourced than even under Obama.
So it's like, where's the silver lining to this? Where do we look at? What good came out of this? And I could name a few things, but at the end of the day, it doesn't justify what it was. I think that the obituary of Trump will read a president that got lost in it, that didn't take a clear enough, guiding role in writing policy and pounding the bricks across the country. Yeah, he held rallies. That's cool. Presidents' jobs aren't to hold rallies; it's to lead the country.
Holding rallies is not going to put more money in your paycheck or my paycheck so we can take care of our loved ones. No. That's the bottom line. It's not going to make the country more secure. And I think one of Trump's many sins, and he has to take responsibility for it. Yes, he was undermined, but he has to put the big boy pants because, as Harry Truman reputedly said, the buck stops here. And the fact of the matter is Trump there was the possibility for Trump to really affect a realignment in American politics. And there were some Democrats like Sherrod Brown, as you and I mentioned, regarding the tax bill to re-incentivize higher wages and reindustrialization. And Trump, allowed Paul Ryan and the Tea Party types and others and the big business lobby to totally undermine that. You take a look at Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders said, look, I'll support Trump if he puts pro-worker policies or legislations forth regarding unions or pulling out or renegotiating bad trade agreements and whatnot, then he would support Trump. He said that early in his administration. I mean, there were small doors that were actually kind of big doors that were open that Trump could have taken advantage of. And this should be a lesson for true populists, because I question really whether Trump truly believed this or not. I think he had certain intuitions, but I think at this point, I don't think he was that serious about it because he was prone to flattery. He was, he had his personal issues, if you will. And I think that stopped him from really being an effective president, essentially. He, was a narcissist. He was easily manipulated and prone to flattery and whatnot, and easily manipulated. He wasn't this master negotiator that he promised to be, at least from an outsider looking in and following the documented evidence and whatnot, trying to take everything in. And, and Biden, I want Biden to succeed, and I hope the progressive populists win the Democratic Party. I hope they push Biden like hell. And people like AOC and Bernie and others, they hopefully, and Nina Turner, who's expected to win a congressional seat in Ohio. I mean, I hope they really push hard for a second New Deal, essentially, that hopefully will save capitalism. Because I have a lot of concerns about the durability of our economic and political system. You know, one of the things that I found in the RT article that was very interesting that was mentioned, and of course the Russians would know this, that quote, China bends Chinese corporations to its will. The United States, under the Trump administration, defends corporations to its own detriment, even when they have a habit for turning around and stabbing the country in the back. And I think that's so true. There's a lot of truth to that, and the Russians would know because, well, number one, the Russian state has a lot of control over its domestic economy still, and B, the Russians and their Soviet predecessors. I mean, they perfected the art on manipulating American corporations to their advantage, using greed, essentially, greed, naivete, and sort of this misplaced internationalism and globalism. And the fact of the matter is that the Trump administration, when confronting corporate America selling out the national security and our prosperity, the fact of the matter is you need a coordinated strategy to deal with it. And really, I think Trump did not fully understand the art of strategy, especially when constructing policy, because he really wasn't interested in policy and governing. And that has come out, at least by his detractors. And frankly, I believe it because we see the finished product. Essentially, he let others do the governing and the policy making, and he believed the promises of people like Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell and many within his administration. Um, and, this is what we get. We get, as one think tank that deals with national security pointed out, that Trump's China policy was confrontational without being competitive. I do agree with tariffs. I think incrementally we need to increase them to an average of 25%, particularly on our trade deficit partners. But to reindustrialize the United States, you need a national plan to do that. You need to incentivize college graduates through free college if need be, as long as you maintain a 3.0 or higher GPA for majors that are needed to reindustrialize the United States: engineering, biology, medicine, various trades and vocational schools like welding and carpentry and other majors that are all geared towards reindustrializing the United States. You need that to tap into your human capital. I would also have a program that will reach out to the retired boomers who used to work in industry sectors that are long dormant, give them financial incentives to consult with new entrepreneurs willing to reopen long dormant or struggling industrial sectors. And thirdly, what I would also do is you're going to have to re-incentivize production over financial speculation. And the Milton Friedman shareholder only value capitalism, and that needs to be reconfigured by public law, and frankly also taking a look at redoing our constitution that stipulates both rights and duties for corporations and banks. Fourthly, do Buy America provisions for infrastructure projects and for defense procurement. And fifth is also nationalize the Federal Reserve. Alexander Hamilton called for a nationalized central bank under the control of the federal government that will disperse credit to new industrial ventures under the control of the private sector. That's something we should really consider doing: nationalize the Federal Reserve and create a third national bank. But Trump, unfortunately, other than Navarro and Lighthizer, didn't have these types of people, didn't tap into these people for his administration. So they couldn't guide him and massage his ego and massage his mind in the right direction. And to me, the lesson learned if you enter politics don't run in the as a Democrat or Republican. If you have a lot of money, millions, if not billions of dollars, do what the Koch brothers did and create your own network of think tanks, your beachhead in Congress, and start growing it from the bottom and start influencing institutions. That's how you do it, because you have to build a new movement from scratch. You're going to have to somehow hire the best political talent and reach people like you and I so we can be recruited in a new effort, because we are majority opinion. The issues are on our side on a lot of things here. If you look at Pew Research polls, it has to take this person who is strategic minded enough to somehow, with a team of people, allow people like us nationally to coalesce together. And, the Russia Today article, and I'll conclude with this, really had some very good advice. Quote, to be successful, the next populist movement will have to be a coalition between disenfranchised factions on both left and right. You and me, Herschel, come from the right, as I think the listeners know by now. Clear, principled, and firm. Clear, principled, and firm. Something Trump really was not, in my opinion. It will need to have zero tolerance for corporate apologism, counterproductive foreign policy, nepotism, and other dust-ridden artifacts from administrations and campaigns gone by. And frankly, with all due respect, also quitting the bullshit culture wars that divide us and don't make us secure, safer, or more prosperous. And also, and also quit picking on people without power, too. And that includes immigrants. I'm not saying open borders, but quit picking on powerless people. The threat to this country is the powerful in many respects. There are some powerful people on our side, but most of the powerful people, frankly, are not on our side, and it is what it is. That's just the facts. And I conclude with that.
Well, Nevin, it was a pleasure. And I look forward next week. I'd like to do next week for the viewers and kind of for you to kind of chew on this idea. So we're doing an obituary for Trump and his presidency. I think next week we should focus on the Biden presidency and what it's going to entail. A little bit after the inauguration, kind of talking about what the Biden administration could accomplish, what it should do, what it should try to stay away from. And, well, look, Trump's no longer, will by then no longer be the president. And the buck will stop with Biden then. And we'll get to witness if Joe Biden can basically go against every, the preconceived notion that he'll do nothing. And that's pretty much how I think he'll do. But maybe he won't. But the one thing I would tell the viewers and anybody that listens to this is right now is a very important moment in American history. And that if this goes south, we may lose all of it forever. I'm not happy with a lot of things. But I'm not going to take out my unhappiness on other people that have no say-so in how this goes. Your Democrat neighbor down the road didn't decide this election. Your Republican up the street, he didn't write the tax bill. Us people, the working class, the people that make the money, the people that protect the country, that do all the crappy jobs that the wealthy and the 1% get to credit for. We are the only people that can fix this. And I'd like you to take a minute before you talk about harming others to further your political agenda one way or another. That person that you'll harm is almost definitely not the person responsible. Focus your energy and focus your attention on all of these people that are the people that wrote the bills, that are the ones that sent your job to China, that is the reason that your son died in Iraq. Don't let them divide us even further. Nevin, it was a pleasure. And I really enjoyed this, and I look forward to the next time we can.
Me too. You did a wonderful job and hit on so many Good points, Herschel. Spoke them really well, and I look forward to next weekend's show.